My own family called me a delusional fool. The town realtor literally laughed in my face when I refused to sell. They all thought I was the family joke for inheriting nothing but a rotting, empty barn. That was before I shattered the concrete floor and unearthed a dead millionaire's empire. The mahogany-paneled office of Hayes and Higgins Associates smelled of lemon polish and impending disappointment. Outside the towering windows, the dreary autumn rain of Chester County, Pennsylvania, mirrored the mood in the room. At least, my mood. Across the massive oak desk sat my cousin, Ronald Pendleton, a man whose custom-tailored Italian suit cost more than my car. He was scrolling on his phone, barely suppressing a smirk. At the head of the desk sat Robert Hayes, a seasoned estate lawyer who looked like he'd rather be undergoing a root canal than managing the final affairs of my late great-uncle, Arthur Pendleton. Uncle Arthur was a legend, and a complicated one at that. In the 1980s, he built a logistics and shipping empire from the ground up, amassing a fortune that landed him on the edges of the Forbes list. He was a titan of industry, ruthless and brilliant. But after the 1987 Black Monday crash, something inside Arthur's shifted. He didn't lose his wealth, but he lost his trust in the world. He became deeply paranoid, withdrew from society, and spent the last 20 years of his life as a wealthy recluse on his sprawling 200-acre estate, Oakhaven. When Arthur passed away of a sudden heart attack at 82, the family descended like vultures. I was the outlier. I was the nephew who had actually visited the old man, not for his money, but because beneath the tin-foil hat paranoia, he was a fascinating, brilliant storyteller. I used to sit on his porch, drinking cheap black coffee, listening to him rant about the collapse of the banking system. "Let's proceed," Mr. Hayes said, adjusting his reading glasses. He cleared his throat and began reading the stipulations of the will. It was a bloodbath of favoritism, orchestrated by a man who loved to play games from beyond the grave. Ronald, who hadn't spoken to Arthur in a decade, was gifted the main Oakhaven manor, the pristine vintage car collection, and the entirety of Arthur's liquid assets, which Hayes estimated at nearly $12 million. Other distant cousins received lucrative stock portfolios and offshore accounts. Then, Hayes turned the page, and the room grew dead silent. "To my grandnephew Thomas," Hayes read, his voice wavering slightly, "I leave the 1.5-acre parcel on the northern boundary of the estate, containing the original 1920s agricultural barn. May he find the value of hard work within its walls." Ronald burst out laughing. He literally threw his head back and guffawed. "The North Barn?" he choked out, wiping a tear from his eye. "Tommy, he left you the rat sanctuary. That place has been condemned since 2005. The roof is caved in." I sat frozen, the words echoing in my head. The North Barn. It was a dilapidated, rotting structure at the absolute edge of the property, surrounded by overgrown blackberry brambles and a collapsed rusted fence. It was completely worthless. The county tax assessor had recently appraised that specific slice of land at essentially zero, given the massive cost required to demolish the hazardous structure. "Is that it?" I asked Hayes, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid so, Thomas," Hayes replied, offering a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile. "The deed has already been transferred to your name. The taxes, however, are now your responsibility." As we walked out of the law firm into the freezing rain, Ronald clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Tell you what, Tommy," he said, his breath smelling of expensive espresso. "I'm going to need a place to build my new tennis courts. The main estate doesn't have the right grading. I'll give you $5,000 for that toxic waste dump. Cash. It saves you the demolition fees, and it saves you the embarrassment. I looked at Ronald. I looked at the smug, entitled sneer that had defined his entire life. Something twisted in my gut. Arthas was crazy, yes. But he wasn't cruel. He knew I was struggling. He knew I had just lost my teaching job due to budget cuts and was barely making rent. To leave me a literal pile of garbage while making Ronald a multimillionaire, it didn't fit. Not unless it was a test. "No thanks, Ronald," I said, stepping out from under his umbrella. "I think I'll keep it." "Suit yourself, idiot," Ronald scoffed, climbing into the back of his waiting town car. "Enjoy the tetanus." The next morning, I drove out to Oakhaven. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised, heavy grey. I parked my beat-up truck at the edge of the property line. There it stood, the North Barn. It was a monstrous, sagging structure of weathered grey wood. The massive sliding doors hung off their rusted tracks, groaning in the wind. The smell of wet rot, decay, and decades of accumulated animal droppings hit me before I even crossed the threshold. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a crowbar, and a pair of heavy leather work gloves, I stepped inside. It was worse than I thought. The cavernous interior was a graveyard of agricultural history, rusted tractors from the 1950s, mountains of mouldy, solidified hay bales, and thousands of empty glass mason jars stacked in precarious towers. The roof had indeed caved in on the eastern side, allowing the elements to rot the wooden floorboards into a spongy, treacherous mess. For 2 straight weeks, I lived in a state of exhausting, back-breaking denial. Every day from sunrise to sunset, I hauled out trash. The townspeople caught wind of what I was doing. The local hardware store owner laughed when I came in to buy heavy-duty contractor bags. "Heard you're renovating the Pendleton rat trap, Tom," he chuckled. "Finding any gold doubloons in the horse manure?" It was humiliating. My hands were blistered, my back was in agony, and my bank account was draining fast just from the disposal fees at the local dump. By day 14, sitting on an overturned rusted bucket in the freezing draft of the barn, I finally broke. I buried my face in my hands, the dust and sweat stinging my eyes. Ronald was right. I was an idiot. Arthas hadn't left me a secret. He had left me a chore. He had left me his garbage. In a fit of frustrated rage, I grabbed my crowbar and swung it as hard as I could at the spongy wooden floorboards near the center of the barn. Clang! The impact sent a violent, vibrating shockwave up my arms. I dropped the crowbar, wringing my hands in pain. That wasn't the dull thud of rotting pine. That was the sharp, unforgiving ring of solid metal striking concrete. I fell to my knees, ignoring the dirt, and began tearing at the rotted wood with my bare, gloved hands. The floorboards here were fake. They weren't structural. They were simply laid over the ground like a decorative rug. I ripped away a 4x4 section of the wood, uncovering a thick, heavy layer of compacted dirt and straw. Grabbing a shovel, I started digging. The dirt was tightly packed, almost as if it had been mechanically compressed. 4 inches down, my shovel scraped against something hard and unyielding. I grabbed a stiff, bristled push broom and furiously swept away the remaining soil. My breath hitched in my throat. Stretching out before me was a flawlessly level slab of modern, high PSI poured concrete. It was massive, at least 20 feet by 20 feet. This wasn't a 1920s foundation. The rest of the barn was built on old fieldstone and dirt. This concrete was pristine, devoid of cracks. and looked like it had been poured within the last 10 years. Why would Uncle Arthur's hire a crew to pour a military-grade concrete pad inside a condemned barn, only to camouflage it with dirt and rotting floorboards? I spent the rest of the night pacing the perimeter of the slab with my flashlight. Towards the very center, I noticed a subtle variation in the concrete's texture. It was a faint, perfectly square outline, about 4 feet by 4 feet. A seam. It had been filled in with a resin compound to blend with the rest of the floor, but under the harsh, angled beam of the flashlight, the geometry was undeniable. It was a cap. The next morning, I drove into town and maxed out my last credit card at the equipment rental yard. I walked out with a 14-inch gas-powered Hilti concrete saw with a diamond blade, industrial ear protection, and an oversized pry bar. When I returned to the property, a sleek black Mercedes SUV was parked blocking my driveway. My blood ran cold. Standing by the barn doors was Greg Sullivan, the owner of Sullivan Builds, a high-end contracting firm in the area. Ronald used him for all his development projects. "Tom!" Greg called out, his eyes darting toward the heavy equipment in the back of my truck. "Your cousin asked me to come take some soil samples. He's drawing up the blueprints for the tennis courts. Wants to make sure the water table is low enough." "The tennis courts aren't going here, Greg," I said tightly, stepping out of the truck. "Because I didn't sell." "Yeah, well, Ronald thinks you'll come around," Greg said, smirking. He tried to peer past me into the dark interior of the barn. "What are you doing with the demo saw? You're not trying to take this death trap down yourself, are you? You need permits for that, buddy." "I'm repairing the foundation for a workshop," I lied smoothly. "And this is private property. Tell Ronald if he sends you here again, I'll have the sheriff cite you for trespassing." Greg held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes lingered on the saw. "All right, man. Take it easy. Just doing my job." I waited until his taillights disappeared down the country road before I rushed into the barn and bolted the heavy wooden doors shut from the inside. The clock was ticking. Ronald was getting suspicious, and if he realized there was something valuable here, he had the legal and financial firepower to tie me up in court for the next 10 years. I had to know what was under that floor immediately. I fired up the Hilti saw. The roar of the 2-stroke engine was deafening in the enclosed space. I lowered the spinning diamond blade onto the resin seam. Sparks exploded in a brilliant, blinding shower as the blade bit into the concrete and the steel rebar hidden within it. The smell of ozone, burning resin, and pulverized rock filled the air, choking me. Sweat poured down my face, mixing with the fine layer of grey dust that coated everything. It took 4 agonizing hours. My arms were trembling so violently from the vibration of the saw that I could barely hold it straight. Finally, the blade sliced through the last corner of the square. I shut off the machine, gasping for air in the sudden, ringing silence. I grabbed the heavy pry bar, wedged it into the newly cut groove, and threw my entire body weight backward. The 4-foot concrete cap groaned. I repositioned the bar and pushed again. With a grinding crack, the heavy block shifted. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I levered the concrete slab upward and pushed it over. It slammed onto the adjacent floor with an impact that shook the barn walls. A blast of cold, stale air rushed up to hit me in the face. It smelled of rust, old paper, and something metallic. I shone my flashlight down into the dark abyss. It wasn't a shallow hole. Below the concrete was a heavily reinforced steel shaft. An aluminum marine-grade ladder was bolted to the side, descending about 15 feet down into absolute darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked my phone. No signal. If I fell down there, no one would ever find me. But the memory of Ronald's mocking laughter echoed in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs over the edge and began to climb down. The descent was eerie. The temperature dropped drastically with every rung. When my boots finally hit solid ground, I turned the flashlight beam forward. I was standing in a small, concrete-lined antechamber. It looked like the airlock of a Cold War bunker. Directly in front of me was a massive circular steel door, resembling a bank vault. It was painted a dull, utilitarian grey. In the center of the door was a digital, heavy-duty sergeant and green leaf keypad. But that wasn't what made my breath catch. Bolted to the steel door, right at eye level, was a clipboard. On it was a single sheet of heavy cardstock paper. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I shone the light on it. It was written in Uncle Arthur's unmistakable, jagged handwriting. Thomas, if you are reading this, it means you didn't take the easy way out. You didn't sell to that parasite Ronald. You dug. You worked. You earned the truth. The world believes I lost my fortune in '87. They are fools. I didn't lose the empire, Thomas. I liquidated it. I took it out of the hands of the banks, out of the stock market, and away from the vultures. The code is the date we went fishing on Lake Erie. The year it all burned down. Be careful. What is inside this vault will change your life. But there are people who have been looking for it for 30 years. Once you open this door, you can never close it again. I stared at the keypad. The silence of the underground chamber was deafening. I wasn't just inheriting money. I was inheriting Arthur's war. My hands hovered over the cold rubber keys of the sergeant and Greenleaf lock. The date we went fishing on Lake Erie. The year it all burned down. Arthur's stories from the porch flooded back. He never stopped talking about the 1987 stock market crash. Black Monday. He had always claimed he saw it coming. The date was etched into the financial history books. October 19th, 1987. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, leaving a streak of grey dust across my skin, and punched in the numbers. 101987. A sharp electronic beep echoed in the concrete chamber, followed immediately by the heavy mechanical thunk of a massive locking bolt retracting. A green LED light flickered to life above the handle. I grabbed the steel wheel, planted my boots on the concrete floor, and pulled. With a hiss of equalizing air pressure, the heavy vault door swung outward. It moved with terrifying smoothness, revealing a pitch-black expanse. I stepped inside, sweeping my flashlight across the room. My beam caught a bank of old-school toggle switches on the wall. I flipped the first one. A low hum vibrated through the floor as a heavy-duty diesel generator, likely buried somewhere further out in the field, purred to life. Overhead, rows of cool, industrial fluorescent lights snapped on in sequence, illuminating a room that defied logic. It was easily the size of a 3-car garage, lined floor to ceiling with reinforced steel shelving. But it was the contents of those shelves that made my knees weak. Arthur hadn't just liquidated his assets. He had physically hoarded them. Neatly stacked on heavy wooden pallets at the center of the room were rows of dull yellow bricks. I walked over, my breath visible in the chilled, climate-controlled air. I picked one up. It was astonishingly heavy, stamped with the insignia of the Royal Canadian Mint. A 1-kilogram gold bar. There were hundreds of them. At current market values, I was looking at an absolute fortune in untraceable bullion. But the gold was only the beginning. Lining the left wall were dozens of fireproof filing cabinets. I pulled open the top drawer of the nearest one. It was packed with pristine, sealed plastic sleeves containing bundles of Swiss francs and US $100 bills, all dating back to the late 1990s. "You absolute madman," I whispered to the empty room. Arthas hadn't trusted the digital world. He had built his own central bank beneath a rotting horse barn. I moved to the back of the vault, where a small mahogany desk sat incongruously amidst the industrial shelving. On top of it lay a thick black leather ledger, resting beside an old, heavy Smith & Wesson .38 special revolver. I ignored the gun and opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Arthas's meticulous, spider-like handwriting. It wasn't just a financial inventory. It was a diary. It was a weapon. I began to read, and the blood drained from my face. Arthas hadn't just hoarded his own wealth. He had documented the financial sins of everyone around him. There were detailed accounts, complete with bank transfer confirmation numbers, of how Ronald's father had systematically embezzled millions from Arthas's logistics company in the early 90s to fund his real estate empire. "They think they are self-made," Arthas had written in the margins. "They built their castles on my stolen bricks. I let them have the illusion, but I kept the receipts." If this ledger saw the light of day, the entire Pendleton family fortune, the very wealth Ronald had just inherited, would be subject to massive federal fraud investigations, IRS audits, and likely criminal charges. The main estate, the cars, the liquid assets, it was all built on a foundation of documented theft. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the vault was shattered by a sound from above. It was faint at first, muffled by the 15 feet of earth and concrete, but unmistakable. The roaring whine of a high-powered diesel engine. Then the loud, chaotic crash of heavy timber splintering. Someone was tearing down the barn doors. Panic seized my chest. I rushed to the vault door and peered up the steel shaft. Daylight was streaming down, but it was being choked out by a massive cloud of dust. "Check the floor! He was using a saw!" a voice yelled. It was Greg Sullivan. "I want him off my property," another voice screamed. The sheer, shrill entitlement was instantly recognizable. Ronald. I had locked the barn doors from the inside, but Greg must have brought an excavator or a heavy-duty truck to ram right through them. They hadn't just come to snoop. They had come to take over the site. "Holy hell, Ronald. Look at this," Greg's voice echoed down the shaft. "He cut a trapdoor. There's a bunker down here." I stepped back into the vault. My mind raced. I was trapped underground with millions in gold, a loaded revolver, and a ledger that could destroy my cousin's life. I grabbed the black leather book and shoved it into the back waistband of my jeans, pulling my heavy flannel shirt over it. I took a deep breath, fighting the adrenaline tremor in my hands. "Hey!" Ronald's voice barked down the ladder well. "Tommy, I know you're down there. Get your ass up here right now." I didn't answer. I slowly walked to the ladder, grabbed the aluminum rungs, and began to climb into the light. When my head cleared to the top of the shaft, the dust was still settling in the barn. A massive yellow skid-steer loader was parked half inside the structure, its steel bucket having completely pulverized the antique sliding doors. Standing at the edge of the exposed concrete slab was Ronald, his face flushed purple with rage. Greg Sullivan stood behind him, clutching a heavy crowbar, looking decidedly nervous. I climbed out, dusting my knees off, and stood up straight. I was covered in dirt, sweat, and concrete dust. Ronald looked like he had just stepped out of a GQ magazine shoot. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Ronald?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "This is my property. You just committed a felony." "Your property?" Ronald spat, taking a step forward. He peered down into the dark, illuminated shaft, his eyes widening greedily. "This is an illegal excavation on Pendleton Estate grounds. The will clearly stated you received the surface parcel. Subterranean rights and historical caches default to the primary estate holder. My lawyers drafted that clause specifically because Arthas was a paranoid freak." He was lying, bluffing to see if I would fold. But the greed in his eyes was authentic. He could smell the money. "Go down there, Greg," Ronald commanded, pointing at the hole. "See what he found." Greg took a step forward, raising the crowbar slightly. "I wouldn't do that, Greg," I said, my voice hardening. I didn't reach for a weapon, but I stood directly between him and the hole. "You're a contractor, not a thug. You trespass down that ladder, and I guarantee you'll lose your commercial license by the end of the week." Greg hesitated, looking between me and Ronald. He lowered the crowbar. "Look, Mr. Pendleton, I'm just here to do soil tests." "Coward," Ronald hissed. He turned his venom back to me. "Listen to me, you pathetic squatter. I don't know what Arthur's buried down there. Probably jars of old urine and tin foil. But whatever it is, it belongs to the estate. It belongs to me. I'm calling the police, and I'm having you removed for trespassing and vandalism." He pulled his phone from his pocket, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face. "Before you dial 911, Ronald," I said, reaching behind my back, "you might want to call your father's old accountant first." I pulled the black leather ledger from my waistband and held it up. The heavy, gold-embossed spine caught the dusty light filtering through the broken roof. Ronald paused, his thumb hovering over his screen. "What is that? Are you trying to steal Arthas's diaries now?" "It's an accounting ledger," I replied, opening the book to a page I had bookmarked with my thumb. Dated August 14th, 1992. It details a wire transfer of $2.4 million from Arthas's corporate logistics account into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company owned by your father. Ronald's smug smile faltered. The color began to drain from his face. "There are hundreds of entries, Ronald," I continued, my voice echoing in the ruined barn. "Decades of meticulous financial records detailing exactly how your side of the family stole millions from Arthas to build your real estate portfolio. He kept every routing number, every forged signature, every piece of blackmail. He called it his insurance policy." "You're bluffing," Ronald whispered, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant sting. "That's garbage. The old man was crazy." "Maybe," I said, closing the book with a loud, definitive snap. "But the IRS doesn't care about mental health. They care about paper trails, and this trail leads directly to the estate you just inherited. If I walk out of here and hand this to the federal authorities, your assets will be frozen by midnight. You'll lose the manor, the cars, the accounts. You'll spend the next 10 years in federal court, and you'll likely end up in a penitentiary." Dead silence fell over the barn. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Greg Sullivan slowly backed away, realizing he had just stepped into the middle of a massive, radioactive family dispute. Ronald stared at the black book in my hands. His jaw worked silently. He looked down at the concrete hole, then back up at me. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by naked, shivering terror. He knew his family's history. He knew it was true. "What do you want?" Ronald choked out, his voice cracking. "First," I said, stepping closer to him, forcing him to take a step back, You are going to get off my property right now. You are never going to set foot on this parcel of land again." Ronald nodded frantically. "Second," I continued, "you are going to call Hayes at the law firm. You are going to sign a legally binding quit-claim deed, relinquishing any and all obscure rights, mineral, subterranean, or otherwise, to this land and everything on it, under it, or near it. You will make it ironclad." "Okay," Ronald breathed, raising his hands defensively. "Okay, Tommy, just keep that book quiet. Please. If you ever bother me again, Ronald, or if I even see a drone flying over this barn," I said, my tone ice-cold, "I mail this book to the FBI field office in Philadelphia." "I understand," he stammered. He turned on his heel, almost tripping over a piece of broken wood, and fast-walked toward his Mercedes. Greg Sullivan practically sprinted back to his skid steer, reversing it out of the barn with reckless speed. I stood alone in the dust, listening to the vehicles speed away down the dirt road. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of a rotting building anymore. It was the silence of total freedom. Over the next 6 months, my life changed drastically, but quietly. I hired William Cross, a notoriously discreet wealth management attorney from New York, to help me slowly and legally integrate the bullion and cash into legitimate tax-compliant trusts. We established a foundation in Arthur's name, dedicated to funding local tradesmen and agricultural programs. I never sold the barn. Instead, I spent $2 million having it meticulously restored. I replaced the rotted pine with reinforced oak, fixed the roof, and turned the interior into a state-of-the-art woodworking shop. The concrete slab remained in the center, a permanent reminder of the foundation my life was built upon. Ronald kept his word. He stayed far away from my property line, quietly living in his manor, forever looking over his shoulder, terrified of the ghost in the black ledger. They laughed when I inherited the empty barn. They thought I was the punchline to a dead man's joke. But as I sit here today, drinking cheap black coffee on the restored porch of that very barn, I realize Arthur wasn't joking at all. He was just waiting for someone willing to dig for the punchline. Wow, what an incredible journey. If Thomas's story of hard work, uncovering a millionaire's secret vault, and outsmarting his greedy cousin kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this video with the friend who loves a satisfying plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, real-life drama stories. What would you do if you found a secret bunker? Let me know in the comments below.